Silence fell over the room. Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's youngest leader, approached the podium at the international summit with a red folder in his hand. No one could have guessed that. Inside that folder were documents that would shake the world. "Today, I will show you the truth," he said, leaning toward the microphone. "And this truth explains why Africa has remained poor for the past 60 years. The assembled world leaders shifted discomfortably in their seats. The UN General Assembly Hall was filled with presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs from across the globe, gathered for the annual International Development Summit. This year's theme was Sustainable Growth in Developing Nations, a topic that had been discussed countless times with the same compromises repeated year after year. Ibrahim Traoré was not supposed to be a featured speaker. The 38-year-old leader of Burkina Faso had only been in power for 2 years. Following a transition that Western media had labeled controversial, his name had been added to the scatologist. 3 days earlier, after intense lobbying from the African Union, the program listed him for a brief 5-minute address, a courtesy inclusion that no one expected would be memorable. The peripheral nations had already given their speeches. The American president had announced a new African Prosperity Initiative, with promises of $5 billion in development aid. The Chinese premier had detailed infrastructure investments across the continent. The French president had spoken eloquently about ties and partnership, the usual diplomatic dance. Now, as Traoré rested at the podium, many diplomats were checking their phones or whispering towards. Few were paying attention to their own African leader in his simple military uniform without decoration or medals, a stark contrast to the tailored suit and ceremonial regalia around him. For too long, Traoré continued, his voice steady and measured. "We have been told that Africa's poverty is the result of corruption, poor governance, or lack of capacity. Today, I will provide evidence that these are merely symptoms of a much deeper problem." A few more heads looked up. There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence, that commanded attention. Traoré opened the red folder and removed a stack of documents. "What I hold in my hands are classified immune check, banking records, and strategic plans that were never meant to see the light of day." Now, the room was completely silent. Even the interpreter seemed to hesitate. "These documents were obtained by our intelligence service over the past 18 months. They have been authenticated by independent experts. They reveal a coordinated strategy by certain powers represented in this room to systematically undermine African sovereignty and continue the extraction of our resources at minimal cost." The Secretary General, seated behind Traoré, leaned forward with concern. This was not the diplomatic address he had expected. A representative from France's delegation rose slightly, as if preparing to object, then thought better of it and sat back down. "Let me be specific," Traoré said, placing the first document into a camera that projected it on massive screens throughout the hall. "This is a memo dated March 17, 2023. From the Strategic Resources Department of a European nation to its embassy across West Africa." The document appeared on screen, letterhead clearly visible. It was marked Confidential Strict Priority Level 1. "I will read the highlighted section," Traoré continued, "given the growing Chinese and Russian influence in the region, it is imperative that we secure preferential access to critical mineral reserves. Our economic analysis indicates that current market price will make extraction unprofitable in newer territories, but the regulatory event in West Africa allows for agreements that can reduce costs by up to 80%. Use all available channels of influence to prevent resource nationalism policies." Murmurs spread through the hall. The delegation from the implicated country was frantically making calls. "This is one document among hundreds," Traoré said, placing another paper under the camera. "Here is a banking record showing payments of 3.2 million euros to the personal account, OFA, former minister in my country, authorized by a mining corporation 1 week before they were granted a 50-year license for gold extraction. A license set allocated only 3% of profits to our nation." He placed a third document under the camera. "And here is perhaps the most disturbing evidence. A detailed strategy for destabilizing governments that attempt to renegotiate I quote, Support for opposition groups should appear organic and unconnected to our interests. Military intervention should remain a last resort, with preference given tokenomic pressure, targeted corruptional agents, and, if necessary, covert. The U.S. Secretary of State was now on her feet, approaching her president, whispering urgently in his ear. Security personnel around the hall were speaking into their I did not come here to create diplomatic incidents, Traoré, his voice still calm. I came to change the conversation. For decades, we have been told that aid and foreign investment are the solution to Africa's challenges. But these documents show that, while public statements offer partnership, private strategies focus on continued exploitation. He turned apogee in his notes. Let me share some figures. Last year, African nations raised approximately $60 billion in development aid. During the same period, over $240 billion left the continent in resource profits to foreign corporations, and additional $35 billion was lost through illegal tax avoidance, and $50 billion more disappeared through illicit financial flows. The French president rose and approached the Secretary General, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The Secretary General looked troubled but shook his head. I have 10 minutes remaining in my allotted time, Traoré said, noting the commotion. I intend to use it. He placed another document under the camera. This is an internal assessment from the intelligence service of a G7 nation, examining how they might respond if African nations attempted to follow Indonesia's example of recurrent domestic processing of raw materials for export. The conclusion states, this scenario represents an existential threat to our manufacturing superiority and must be prevented through coordinated policy pressure, conditional aid, and strategic security partnerships. The hall had transformed from diplomatic decorum to barrel-like controlled chaos. Delegates were rushing to consult with superiors. Securitydams were reassessing the situation, and journalists were frantically typing on their phones. I understand that discomfort these revelations, Traoré said, but consider our discomfort. When we uncover evidence that poverty of our nations is not accidental, but strategic. Colonel Hassanosi, Traoré's head of security, approached the podium and whispered urgently in his ear. Sir, we've received threats. Security cannot be guaranteed if you continue. Traoré nodded, but continued speaking. These documents will all be published online within the hour, along with thousands of others detailing decades of systematic exploitation, but exposing this truth isn't the beginning. He closed the red folder and looked directly at the assembly. I am not here to condemn or threaten. I am here to offer a new path for Burkina Faso, along with 12 other African nations, has created what called the Sankara Protocol, a new framework for international economic cooperation. The name was significant. Thomas Sankara Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from the 1980s had been assassinated after challenging Nocolian economic structures. The Sankara Protocol establishes 3 fundamental principles. Content. First, all extraction of natural resources must provide fair value to host nations with transparent contracts open to public scrutiny. Second, processing of raw materials must increasingly occur within our borders, creating jobs and building industrial capacity. Third, historical resource agreements, signed under duress or through documented corruption, will be subject to mandatory renegotiation. Now, a different kind of tension-filled theorem. This was more than an expose. It was a direct challenge to the global economic order. We recognize that change cannot happen overnight. Traoré acknowledged. The protocol includes a 5-year transition period and establishes an independent oversight body with representation from all stakeholders. But make no mistake, change will happen. He looked up from his notes, making eye contact with leaders around the room. Africa's resources will no longer fuel others' prosperity, while our people remain in poverty. This is not a request. This is not a negotiation. This is the new reality. The Secretary General was now standing clearly concerned about the diplomatic crisis unfolding in his assembly hall. I see my time as being cut short, Traoré said. So let me conclude with this. The documents have shown today expose a painful, unsustainable present, but they need not determine our future. To those nations implicated in these papers, we do not seek confrontation. We seek partnership, But on equal terms, he gathered his documents as securitypers begin to converge near Thustage. You have a choice to make. You can deny these revelations, threaten economic reprisals, or even consider more drastic measures. Or you can acknowledge that an economic system built on systematic inequality is ultimately unstable and against everyone's long-term interests. The Secretary General had reached the podium, placing a hand on Traor's shoulder. Mr. President, I must ask you to conclude. Traoré nodded respectfully. My final words, the full digital archive, which we call the transparent syphils, will be available to everyone by the time I leave this stage. The truth is now beyond anyone's control. What we do with that truth is up to all of us. As Traoré stepped away from the podium, the assembly erupted into chaos. Security personnel surrounded him immediately, rushing him toward a side exit. Delegates were shouting across the hall. Media representatives were pushing toward the stage, and the Secretary General was desperately trying to restore order. In the secure room beneath the UN building, Traoré's team was gathered around screens monitoring the global reaction. Dio, his foreign affairs advisor, looked up as he entered. It's done, she said, her expression a mix of pride and concern. The files went live exactly as you stepped away from the podium. Download shave already started worldwide. Colonel Nick was less celebratory. Sir, we need to move quickly. We've received intelligence that certain agencies are considering options to contain these. Contain? Asked Mika, a Traoré's communications director. Is that diplomatic language for assassination? We knew the risks, Traoré said calmly, accepting a cup of water from an aide. Are our contingency measures in place? Yes, sir, confirmed Colonel Nkosi. The additional security teams are deployed. The backup communication systems are active, and the second data release is scheduled for 24 hours from now, regardless of whether you give the confirmation code. This was Theinsern's policy, a second, more detailed release of documents that would automatically trigger if Traoré was detained, killed, or otherwise silenced. The UN Secretary General is requesting an immediate meeting, said Dio looking at her phone, and we've received communication requests from 17 heads off state in the last 3 minutes. Prioritizeth African Union representatives first, Traoré instructed, then the Secretary General. The others will have to wait. As his team coordinated the response, Traoré took a moment to center himself. The path to this day had been long and dangerous. It had begun 18 months earlier, when a young intelligence officer had brought him evidence of unusual financial transactions Serdrand, a gold mining contract that's thread, when pulled, had unraveled a complex web of foreign interference, economic manipulation, and strategic exploitation that spanned decades and crossed continents. Gathering the evidence had required building a specialized team of intelligence operatives, digital experts, and international legal advisors working in absolute secrecy. Every person involved understood that powerful interests would stop at nothing to prevent this information from coming to light. Sir, said Dio, interrupting his thoughts, the first reactions are coming in. Western media is questioning the authenticity of the documents. Several implicated governments have issued denials, but the African Union president has made a statement supporting the Sankara Protocol, and social media is exploding with the hashtag transparency files. And Trop asked, the satellite feed from Ouagadougou shows thousands gathering in Revolution Square. Masaka reported, turning her tablet to show him live images. They're watching your speech on giant screens. The site Office Citizens, many holding the red, green, and gold flag of Burkina Faso, brought a moment of emotion that he quickly controlled. This wasn't about them. It was about generations past and future. Mr. President, said Colonellosi, suddenly alert, we have a situation. Our intelligence indicated several diplomatic vehicles are converging on our hotel, likely with teams. We need to move to location B immediately. This too had been anticipated. The official delegation hotel was a decoy. Trowald be taken to a secure location known only to his innermost circle. How long do we have? Traoré asked, already moving toward the exit. Minutes, Nathors, Ninosi replied grimly. As they hurried through the underground corridors of the UN, Diallo kept Tro updated on the unfolding global reaction. The documents are being downloaded and mirrored on thousands of servers worldwide. They've reached a critical mass. They can't be immune now. This had been the key to their strategy. In the digital age, information once truly released was impossible to completely suppress. They had designed the Transparency Files platform to be resilient against any attempt to silence it. Distributed, encrypted, and mirrored globally, they emerged from a service entrance into an unmarked vehicle with diplomatic plates from a friendly nation. As they pulled away from the UN complex, Traoré could see media frenzy building. Camera crews, protesters, security forces, and curious onlookers were gathering in. "Sir," said Masika, looking at her secure phone, "you're already trending globally. Trop speech, Transparency Files, and Sankara Protocol. The top 3 hashtags, worldwide." Trop nodded but remained focused on more immediate concerns. "Colonel, what's status of our exit strategy? That private jet is fueled and ready at Teterboro Airport." And Kosi confirmed, "But we've received intelligence that suggests they may attempt to prevent. We have alternates in place." The vehicle moved through traffic, part of a 3-car convoy using defensive driving techniques to avoid potential followers. Traoré used these moments to gather his thoughts. He had known from the beginning that this action would make him a target. Revealing the mechanisms of economist exploitation and challenging the global power structure came with several personal risks. History was filled with African leaders who had been overthrown or killed after challenging Western economic interests. But he had also learned from that history. Unlike his predecessors, he had built a network of fallies, created robust contingents, and most importantly, ensured that movement was bigger than any individual, including himself. "New development," reported Dio, reading from her secure tablet. "The presidents of Ghana, Tanzania, and Mozambique have issued joint statements supporting the Sankara Protocol. They're calling for an emergency African Union session." This was significant. The coalition was growing faster than expected. That strategy had been to release the documents and then build support gradually. But the immediacy of their response suggested that many African leaders had been waiting for someone to take the first step. And the opposition, Traoré asked, as expected. Non-reported denials, questions about authentication, accusations of manipulation. The French president hascalled it irresponsible diplomatics. The British Prime Minister is suggesting Russian disinformation. The State Department has issued a statement saying they are reviewing the alleged documents. They're following the standard playbook, Masika observed. Deny, deflect, discredit, but the documents speak for themselves. Indeed, the Transparency Files had been meticulously organized and authenticated. Each document include methoda, verification methods, and contextual information, many contended signatures, official letterheads, and internal codes that would be impossible to fake convincingly. The convoy made an abrupt turn, switching to the contingency route as Nkosi received information about a potential roadblock ahead, remained calm as thief kill accelerated through side streets. "Sir," said Dio, her voice betraying rare excitement. "We're receiving reports that people are gathering in capitals across Africa. Dakar, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Lagos. They're demonstrating in support of the Transparency Files." This was the most powerful aspect of their strategy. By exposing the truth directly to the people, they had created a movement that couldn't be easily suppressed through traditional means of pressure and governance. Colonel Traoré said, "What's the status of our defensive measures back home?" "All military units are on high alert," Nkosi confirmed. "The loyal commanders are in position. Our intelligence network is monitoring for any sign of foreign-backed coup attempts." This was the most immediate. History had shown that when African leaders challenged Western economic interests to directly sudden military coups often followed. "And second phase?" True asked. "Ready to implement on your command?" Della confirmed. "The economic sovereign intelligence is prepared for simultaneous track in all 13 participants. The resource tracking system is online. The alternative banking work is standing by." The second phase was crucial. Exposing the truth was only the beginning. They needed to create new systems that would allow African nations to reclaim control of their resources and economies. Their vehicle approached a private airfield where a mid-sized jet waited on the. But as they neared the entrance, they could see unusual activity. Multiple vehicles with flashing lights and what appeared to be a Patoa checkpoint. that hadn't been there when their advance team had secured the route. Blockade, now said tersely, implementing Contingency C. The convoy made a sharp turn, heading away from their port. Contingency C involved ground transportation to a secondary airfield in a neighboring state, but it would add hours to their journey. Hours during which anything could happen. Traoré phone chimed with an encrypted message. He read it and showed it to his team. UNSC emergency session called resolution being drafted to address destabilizing allegations. Vote expected within hours. They're moving faster, Han anticipated. Dio said, concern evident in her voice. They'll try to set Security Council to discredit those documents and condemn your actions. They'll fail, Trop said with quiet confidence. Too many nations have seen the evidence now. The veto powers may control the Security Council, but they didn't control the truth. As their vehicle continued its evasive route, Masika provided another update from the digital front. The transparency file server is under massive attack. DOS attempts hacking efforts, but the distributed architecture is holding. Downloads continue worldwide. Tro nodded, unsurprised. And the special PAFI, this referred to a specific CTOF documents. They had held back from the initial release. Evidence of illegal activities that went beyond exploitative business practices and into the realm of criminal conspiracy. Primed and ready, confirmed Dio. If they escalate beyond diplomatic pressure, we release the evidence of criminal wrongdoing. The convoy was now on a highway heading west, moving at high speed while maintaining secure communications. Traoré used this time to record a brief video message to the people of Burkina Faso, explaining the situation, assuring them that he was safe and that the mission was proceeding as planned. My fellow citizens, he said, looking directly into the camera of his secure device. Today, we have taken an irreversible step toward true independence, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. The documents we have released prove what many have long suspected, that our poverty is not accidental, but the result of systematic exploitation, he continued with measured confidence. In the coming hours, Ande's powerful interests will attempt to discredit this evidence. They may threaten our economy, our security, even my life, but they cannot threaten our truth. The transparency files are now in the hands of the world. The Sankara Protocol offers a path forward, and together we will build an Africa that controls its own resources and determines its own future. As he concluded the recording, Colonel Nakasira received new intelligence. Sir, we have a confirmation that extraction teams from at least 2 foreign intelligence agencies are actively searching for you in New York. The UN Secretary-General has requested international protection for you, but it's unclear if that request is genuine or a means to look. Traoré considered this information. Continue with contingency. See no contact with anyone outside our secure network until we're airborne. The next few hours will be critical. If they could get safely out of the United States and back to Burkina Faso, Traoré could lead the next phase directly. If not, the contingency plans would activate automatically and the movement would continue without him. New message from Ouagadougou, reported Dio. The Parlamentas convened an emergency session and anonymously ratified the Sankara Protocol. They've also issued a declaration of economic sovereignty. This was proceeding faster than planned, a welcome development that indicated how ready the ground had been for this moment. Sir, said Mika, looking at Herteblot with wide eyes, you need to see this. She handed him the device which showed a live news broadcast. The presidents of Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea were holding an impromptu joint press conference. The Malian president was speaking, have reviewed the documents released by President Traoré and can confirm their authenticity. They match evidence our own intelligence service have gathered over years. Today, we stand with Burkina Faso and announce our immediate adoption of the Sankara Protocol. The coalition was growing by the hour, far faster than they had dared hope. The momentum was building toward a tipping point where attempts to suppress the movement would only strengthen it. Their convoy approached a small regional airport where a private jet with diplomatic regition from a South American ally waited. This time, there was no blockade visible, perimeter secure, confirmed Nkosi. After receiving reports from their advanced team, we have a clear departure window. As they pulled onto the tarmac, Traoré felt a moment of reflection. Decades of history had led to this point. Generations of exploitation. Leaders who had tread before and been silenced. The weight of all this history rested on what happened in the coming days. Boarding the aircraft, he took his seat as his team established a secure communication circuit in the main cabin. As they prepared for takeoff, Dio approached with her tablet. "Mr. President, we're receiving messages from leaders across the global south, not just Africa, but Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. They're requesting access to the Sankara Protocol framework." This was unexpected but logical. The patterns offer source exploitation documented in transparency files weren't limited to Africa. They were replicated wherever valuable resources existed. In less powerful nations, share the framework documents, Trump instructed. This was always meant to be a global movement. AskJet accelerated down the runway. True looked out the window at the American landscape falling away beneath them. For too long, the relationship between nations had been defined by power rather than justice. That transparency files wouldn't change that overnight, but they had created an irreversible crack in the Foundation's OFAN exploitive system. "Sir," said Colonel Nkosi as they reached cruising altitude, "we've received confirmation that the UN Security Council resolution failed. To many nations abstained, including 2 permanent members." This was another positive sign. The traditional mechanisms for controlling global narratives were breaking down in the face of incontrovertible evidence. "What's our current trajectory?" Truist, referring not to the aircraft flight path, but to the larger movement they had set in motion. "Beyond our most projections," Dio responded, reviewing the data on her screen. 27 nations have now expressed support for the Sankara Protocol. The transparency files have been downloaded over 12 million times. Major media outlets have begun authenticating the documents instantly and finding them legitimate in the opposition. "Heprest fracturing," reported Masika. "Western responses are not unified. Some are maintaining denials. Others are reckoning for dialogue. A few are suggesting reforms to address the concerns raised. Corporate stocks for major mining conglomerates have dropped between 15 and 30%. The momentum was clearly building towards system. But Traoré knew from studying history that this was also the most dangerous moment when powerful interrestrialized that conventional responses weren't working and might consider more extreme measures implement the final security protocol. He instructed, "Noose, activate all sleeper cells, deploy their reserve security teams, and initiate Thed man switch for the special pack." These were the most severe protective measures they had designed, ensuring that even if Traoré and his entire team were eliminated, the movement would continue and additional dumbing evidence would be released. As their flight continued over Traoré allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The truth was out. The framework for change was established. The coalition was growing. Africa's resources might finally benefit Africa's people, but he harbored no illusions about the challenges ahead. Powerful interests would not surrender their advantages easily. There would be economic pressure, political isolation attempts, possibly even military interventions disguised as internal conflicts. Yet, something fundamental had changed. By exposing the mechanisms of exploitation so clearly and presenting a practical alternative, they had shifted the narrative. African nations were no longer supplicants asking for better terms. They were equal partners demanding justice. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, Traoré received word that thousands of people had at the airport in Ouagadougou, waiting to welcome him home. Among them were representatives from across Africa and beyond, coming to join the first official conference on implementing the Sankara Protocol. "We've started something that cannot be stopped," heralded his team as they prepared for landing, "not because of our planning or our courage, but because its time has come. The truth once seen cannot be unseen." The aircraft began its descent toward Burkina Faso, toward a future that, while uncertain, now held possibilities that had seemed impossible just days before. The final document had been revealed, and with it, the first chapter in a new history was being written.